Soldier Mage King, Chapter 9, The Poisoned Chalice, Part 1. Arthur wasn't sure what was worse, the idea that Bayard had tried to poison him, or the fact that his father was making Merlin test it. They had people specifically employed for that, people who were fully aware of the risks of their job. Merlin was not one of those people, but she drank anyway, raising the cup in a near-cruel mockery of a toast. For a moment, nothing happened. Uther rolled his eyes and nodded to Bayard. "She's all yours," he said, and Arthur turned to argue with his father when a horrible, rasping, choking noise filled the room. Arthur whirled on his heel. Merlin was clutching her throat, struggling to breathe. The room seemed to grow cold. "It was poisoned. Guards, seize them!" Arthur ignored his father as Merlin fell, the chalice falling from limp fingers as her eyes rolled up into her head. He made it across the room as she crumpled to the floor, barely stopping her from smacking her head into the stones. He barely felt the spilled wine soaking in the knees of his breeches. He couldn't hear or see anything aside from Merlin's increasingly pale face and the gasping rasps of her breath. Gaius shocked him out of his stupor. He knelt down next to Arthur and placed a hand on Merlin's neck. "We need to get her to my quarters. Bring the goblet. It may be of some use," Gaius ordered. Arthur was careful as he gathered Merlin up into his arms, unwilling to let anyone else touch her. He didn't have a free hand for the cursed cup that had started all of this, but Gwen, bless her, had appeared at his side and snatched up the cup, racing after him. Arthur made it into the room first, carefully depositing Merlin on the patient's cot. She was shivering. Arthur's hands shook. Gaius arrived, moving quickly, considering his age. Gwen hot on his heels. Gaius stepped over to the bed and laid his hand across Merlin's forehead, felt her pulse, frowned. Stepping over to his work table, Gaius called out to Gwen. "The chalice," he demanded, and Gwen handed it over. Gaius frowned. Snatching up a set of long tweezers off the table, he peeled something out of the inside of the cup. Arthur's heart seized. If he'd spotted that before now, could he have prevented all of this? Gaius rounded on a pile of books and yanked one closer to him, flipping through it for a few minutes. "What is it?" Gwen asked, wringing her hands. "It appears to be the petal from the Mortius flower. It's a rare poison. It grows only in the caves of Balor, on the roots of the Mortius tree." "Is there a cure?" Arthur demanded. He had yet to move from Merlin's side. Gaius flipped through the book in front of him for a moment. "Yes, but," he said, frowning. Arthur stood and stepped over to the physician. "But?" he asked, looking down at the book over his shoulder. There was an illustration on the page of a large lizard-like thing snarling. "The only known cure for the Mortius flower's poison is to concoct a potion from the leaves of that same flower," Gaius explained. "That doesn't look friendly," Gwen said, joining them around the book, glancing over at Merlin. "A cockatrice. It guards the forest of Balor. A single drop of its venom would mean near instant death." Silence fell in the room, save for Merlin's labored breathing. "Sounds fun," Arthur said, heading for the door. "Arthur, you can't," Gaius began. He whirled on him. "If I don't, what happens to Merlin?" "The Mortius flower induces a slow, painful death. She'll last out maybe 5 days, but..." Arthur didn't stop to listen to the rest of the physician's words. He was intercepted by his father, who simply told him to ignore Merlin's dying. Not to watch. That people would die for him his whole life. He couldn't accept that, and neither, it seemed, could Morgana, who helped him with his armor and handed him his sword. The stables were a problem, or would have been if Leon hadn't been the one assigned to guard them. "Sire, Leon, I will not watch her die for me. I won't. I can't." Arthur knew his voice was shaking. He didn't care. He hadn't realized how much he cared about Merlin until he'd seen her clawing at her own throat, desperate to breathe. It was as if he could still hear her rattling breaths in his ear. "You'll want Dancer. She's the fastest we have on hand," Leon said, pointing to a horse across the stable. She was already saddled. Arthur tossed his pack over her back, quickly tying it to the saddle. "I'm going to run out after you, as if I tried to stop you. But please, come home safe, sire," Leon said, and Arthur had never been more grateful for the man. Morgana gave Gwen off until Merlin recovered. She herself visited the physician's chambers to check on Arthur's maidservant. Morgana liked the girl. She didn't trip over herself to please Arthur, instead trading good-natured insults with him, and laughing with her and Gwen over court gossip. It had been nearly 2 days since Arthur left. No word had been heard on if he had been seen or not. Merlin looked terrible. She was clammy and shaking slightly. Not shivering, but tremors of pain passed through her every few minutes. Gwen was helping Gaius with something, so Morgana sat down next to Merlin and gently took her hand. She frowned as she spotted something red on the underside of her arm. Gently flipping her arm over, Morgana gasped. A rash was peering out from under Merlin's sleeve. She was still in the ridiculous livery Arthur had made her wear, though it wasn't so bad without the hat. The Pendragon red was stained with sweat, the bright red now closer to the color of blood. Gaius was by her side in a moment. "What is it?" he asked, then spotted the rash and took Merlin's hand from her. "That's not possible." "What's wrong?" Morgana asked as Gaius rushed over to the book that lay open on his desk. "The rash isn't supposed to appear until the final stages of the poison takes hold," he said, flipping a page. "Once the rash appears, death will follow in 2 days." Gaius read off, looking over at his ward in horror. "You said Arthur had 5 days," Gwen bit out, panic in her voice as Morgana's hand shook. "He should have. The poison shouldn't act this quickly unless... "Unless?" Morgana demanded. "Unless it's been enhanced with magic," Gaius said, and both girls gasped. Gaius turned to Gwen. "Before she came bursting into the hall, Merlin was talking to someone, a serving girl from Bayard's retinue." "Kara. She was very pretty and kind," Gwen said, nodding. "Go to the dungeons. Tell them I need you to look for someone among Bayard's men. Find this Kara," Gaius ordered, and Gwen took off at a run. Morgana turned to look at Merlin's sickbed. "You don't believe Bayard did this at all, do you?" she asked, and Gaius shook his head. "He's no sorcerer, nor do I believe he would have employed one. He was too shocked when she fell. I believe he wasn't aware the chalice was poisoned at all," Gaius said with a frown. Gwen returned, shaking her head. "She wasn't there," Gwen confirmed, and Gaius nodded. "I hardly expected her to be." He swore under his breath as something seemed to occur to him. "She would know. The only place the cure can be found is in the Forest of Balor. Arthur's walking into a trap." "Arthur..." A voice. The voice was weak, and everyone in the room turned to Merlin, who groaned in pain. She still hadn't woken. "Arthur..." she mumbled as Gaius stepped over to her, brushing sweat-soaked raven hair out of her face. "Merlin, can you hear me?" he called. She shook. "Arthur, it's too dark. I can't..." She mumbled something. It didn't sound like intelligible words. Gaius swiped at his eyes. Morgana took charge. "Gwen, will you go down to the kitchens? Tell them I sent you. Have them send up something for Gaius. I'll tell the king about this sorceress that hid herself in Bayard's company," she said, and Gwen nodded, rushing off. Morgana stormed out of the room, and with the door shut behind her, Gaius frowned at Merlin, pulling back the blankets on her other hand. A soft, silvery blue light filled the room from the orb floating in Merlin's hand. Gaius gasped. The fact that Merlin was capable, even while dying, of this much magic was nearly a miracle. But it also likely meant that Arthur was in danger. If Merlin's mutterings were accurate, he was somewhere dark and dangerous. She was nearly silently begging him to leave something behind. Gaius watched, unable to do anything, as the light in her hand flickered out and her breathing became even more labored.